we are talking about money. But before we talk about money, we need to talk a little bit about something that happened. It took 21 years, but the Mariners made it into the playoffs.
Woo.
That was a really big deal. Really big deal. I mean, when you think about it, when the Seattle baseball club, bought the Mariners for $100 million from Jeff Smulyan back in 1992, the idea for the fans was to see a team that competed and made the playoffs. And we made them in 95 and 96. But as time went along, the focus, you have to wonder about what the real focus was. It wasn't that they didn't want to compete. The Mariners spent, in 2008, they spent $117 million. They were in the top 10 of payrolls, and they lost 101 games.
I remember, I got a funny story about that. I remember looking in the paper, and I wasn't of drinking age, but there was a local bar that beers were whatever price Richie Sexton's batting average was at that time. And I remember at one point my dad commenting, like, wow, I should start, pick up drinking because it's getting so cheap.
Well, remember you won't remember, but back in the 1980s when Dave Valley came up, they were selling for Dave Valley's batting average. But they spent a lot of money. They lost 101 games, but they did better in 2009, but they spent only $98 million. And then 2010, they lost 101 games again. So what changed? Ownership changed. What the focus was, it seemed, for the management under Howard Lincoln was to make money from the baseball team. And when you think about it, they bought the team for $100 million from Smulyan in 1992. They sold it for $1.2 billion in 2019. I remember going to a reception in 2019 when John Stanton bought the baseball team, and he said, most owners will tell you they want to build a team that competes. He said, I want to build a team that wins the World Series. I knew at that time that there was a change. There was a change in the focus that was going to change the culture, and that was going to make a difference. And we're beginning to see that with the Mariners, hopefully, in 2022 and going to 2023. But that's the team. That's a baseball team. We're not here to talk about baseball team. We want to talk about the same thing that happens in companies. And we have one specific company in mind. We use this company. We don't own it in our portfolios. There's no recommendation to buy or to sell. But this is an illustration of what can happen with a team. So why don't you start us off, Al, and tell us.
Yeah, so if you want to look and do the research yourself, the book is called Flying Blind by Peter Robeson. And it's about basically the 737 MAX crash and what changed in Boeing. And the analysis is that the crash happened way before 2018. Right? There were two specific crashes. One, I'm just going to talk about the first one, the one in 2018 in Indonesia, I believe. Mm-hmm. And the reason why this plane went down was some tiny little weather vane. And it's called. It had a 21-degree misalignment in its innards. It's called. It's a kind of an ominous name for a passenger plane, but it's known as the angle of attack sensor. Mm-hmm. But basically, it does. It just measures the wind against the coming in against the plane, and if the software doesn't register, if they don't register right and align right, then the plane takes a nosedive. And their software at that time, they had had all the congressional investigations and FAA things, they realized that the software was not working right, and they buried those parts of the software that nobody could find until this big investigation figured that out.
But they also held off and said it was a pilot error.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the stories was, Mike, and I remember this. They're saying, the guy was the pilot tried to commit suicide. That was the reason why. And they said, I had this investigation. Oh, we need to check all the mental health of all the pilots around the world. And I'm like, well, how many pilots want to go out there and, I'm sure they do that anyways. They have all those. I think they have mandatory retirement ages at 65. They have to pass all the physicals and screenings to do that.
So that was the official story until?
Yeah, until the second crash, which was only 5 months later. And so this one happened on March 10th of 2019. And it was just a couple of months after, like I said, 5 months after the Lion Air and another MAX 8, this one operated by Ethiopian Airlines, took off and never made it home. There was 157 people aboard this flight, and it only lasted about 6 minutes, which is really sad. The pilots, after they took off, shortly realized that there was malfunctions on the plane. They had requested to return to land and unfortunately never did. And Al mentioned this earlier, or just a second ago, but the crash was again as a result of a tug of war between this MCAS system and the pilots. Essentially, like Al said, was the angle of attack sensor, which is at the front of the plane, was off 21 or 23 degrees. It doesn't really matter to me. And the plane, so when the plane essentially, when it was perfectly horizontal, the system would read that it's actually pitched up and it would need to be corrected. And then the rear of the plane, the stabilizers, would then adjust based off of this sensor, so the front and the back. So what ended up happening was a battle between this man and automation. So every time the pilot would try to adjust the pitch of the plane, the computer would then override and correct. And so the software ended up being pretty fatal. So the pilots, I read and went on, and the pilots did everything they could to save the plane. They attempted to turn off the system, but that did not work because every time they turned off the system would restart because of the false reading. And so you would essentially, they just kept going back and forth and back and forth. And this book actually talked about one of the pilots grabbing the manual, going through the entire thing. He talked to the stewardess. They brought everyone in, and then the last thing was I think they said something
on the other flight in Jakarta, they even had an engineer on the back that they brought him up and said, "Hey, can you help us figure this out?"
Yeah.
And
over the overhead, could you imagine that? Hey, Mr. Engineer.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that there was no override for the pilots to manually take control of the plane and say, "Okay, let's fly this thing manually."
Yeah.
And the irony in this, Mike and Chris, is that automation has helped make planes safer.
Mm-hmm.
Taking away the controls from manual controls has made the plane safer. However, when it comes to a situation like that, there has to be something for the pilot to.
But the pilots didn't think so. They thought
some changes.
There's that battle between the automation and the manual flying, right? All the pilots want less automation and want it in their hands, right? There's a few quotes about some big swinging, whats, and it's very interesting. But the funny part, and you brought this up a second ago, Al, is they blamed it on the pilots. Mm-hmm. Ethiopian Airlines, Boeing goes, "Oh, it's pilot error." Well, these pilots one had 5,000 hours and one had 6,000 hours under their belt, which I'm not a pilot, but that's no small feat, right? That 5,000 to 6,000 hours.
They knew what they were doing.
Exactly knew what they were doing. And so it's a far cry from what Boeing used to be, and back in the 80s there was crashes and
the crash in 74 was the.
So what happened? I mean, so we look at two crashes. The Boeing is doing an official story that it was pilot error, when it turns out it was really the automation. So what happened? That was not the way Boeing was years ago, when it was the Lazy Bee. So what happened? Where did it begin? I think we need to go back to the beginning.
Well, I don't know the intimate story. I know what he read in the book. It doesn't go into tremendous detail about, how it does a little bit how he got started. Bill Boeing starting in Seattle with his first wooden planes, right? And then it started basically, there were a bunch of engineers. And when Bill Boeing left in the who was it that took over from?
T. Allen.
And the whole goal was to build a plane. Right, to build the best product they could, the safest and best product they could. Did they have crashes back? Yeah, they did. But when they did, they owned up and what that they made, if they made a mistake, they owned up to it and said, yeah, we that was a design flaw. We should have
Well,
done
there
better.
was a story in the 80s about there was a crash, an early crash, and not only did Boeing come up and say, "Hey, this was our fault," but they provided all of the background they had on the incident. I don't know if you guys remember reading this in the book, but they were so the point of it is the FAA was so taken back by how honest Boeing was, and that started that early reputation of being the good guys.
And it did, because instead of blaming pilots, instead of blaming pilot error, instead of blaming weather conditions, Boeing stepped up and said, we have a design problem and we'll correct it. And
Here's what we know. And they provided all that information.
And the airlines thought a great deal of that. They thought, okay, these guys are honest. Now we can trust what they say. When you blame it on a pilot that's trying to commit suicide or pilot error, when the reality is it's part of the software, you create a credibility problem. And there's a big difference between what happened. But Boeing wasn't the top airline company for a long time. When Bill Boeing started it, it was still. And they started United Airlines at the same time. But it was not a dominating company. But we're going to learn why Boeing became the dominating company right after this commercial break. So don't go away. We'll talk about the growth of Boeing, why it became the dominant company for passenger aircraft. And we'll talk about, after that, we'll talk about what went wrong to lead to the crashes. So don't go away. This is one of those things that doesn't show up in the numbers. You can look at balance sheet, you can look at price earnings, you can look at all those things. It doesn't show up in the earnings. We want to tell you why.
About Money with your AFC team, Mike, Chris, and Al on AM 1300, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Welcome
back. So before the break, we had talked to a little bit about Boeing and some of the competition in the early days, but I want to focus on kind of the turning point, the way that I see it, and in the way that Boeing really kind of took off and started to dominate the next age. And that actually starts days after Germany had surrendered in May of 1945. There was a Boeing engineer. His name was George Schur. And George, if you're out there listening, I apologize. I don't know if you're still alive, but I apologize for the last name. He had actually sent a letter from the forest in a small town of Germany, just this little forest. And this letter would actually, lead to the rise of Boeing. And in this letter, he had basically addressed a couple of things. He was working with a bunch of civilians. He was working with a civilian team and the U.S. Army intelligence to examine some of the files that the Germans had left behind. And what they found was pretty stunning. They actually found that the Germans understood a lot more than anyone else knew about, mating the jet engines with these swept-back wings. At the time, if you could remember, a lot of the planes used propellers, and then they also had these 90-degree perpendicular wings that jetted out from the fuselage. But in these findings, what they had found was that, and it all comes from this wind tunnel data, and they found that there was massive increases in speed and performance when the wings were made to point slightly back, particularly when the engines hung below the wings in pods instead of being nested inside the wings. And so this arrangement then compensated for drag by making it more flexible, meeting the wind resistance. And so really just this small detail, instead of the 90 degree and going, a little, what is it? What am I trying to say? Having them jet out. I mean, it was a game changer. It really was. And if you look at airlines today, they're still using this, this newfound technology.
The design of the wings is the whole technology of an aircraft. It's considered proprietary. It's considered the most important thing they can do. The Bernoulli principle says that when one fluid flows faster than the other, the one that's flowing slower will exert a pressure, an upward pressure, a pressure on the one that's going faster. So if you look at the design of a wing of an airplane, you notice the top part has a much bigger curve than the lower part. And that's very specific reason, because you want the wind or the air going over the upper part to go faster than that going under it. That exerts a pressure to lift things up. That's a key principle. And what they found is by putting the wings at a sweep or
Yeah.
I don't know
at an angle.
at an angle instead of straight across, that gave added lift. And by putting the engines underneath the wings, look at pictures of the DC-3 or the Convair 580. The wings are straight out, and the engines are located in the wings.
And that's the weird part, is like you don't really understand. Like if you look back at these aircrafts, I had to actually look at the picture. If you're near a computer, I would plug these in right now. But the engine was actually part of the wing, built into the wing, which you would think would be the most efficient, right? Not an engine below. You would think it would create more drag, but that was the opposite.
But it's just the opposite.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, I mean, the thought is that as the air rushes over the wing, where the engines were in the Convair 580 or the DC-3, that area didn't get any lift because you've got the engines going. With the swept back wings and the engines hanging down below, the engines are actually pulling the air through, and the air is flowing over the entire wing rather than a part of the wing. That's the key technology for the aviation companies. That's one of the most closely guarded secrets of a Boeing or an Airbus or an Embraer or any of the other aircraft companies. The wing is crucial.
And it's fascinating the Germans found this out in 1945 before anyone. You know, there's the stories about NASA scientists, you know, coming from Germany as well. And it makes you wonder what they were, you know, they were so advanced for their time.
But that allowed Boeing, competing against other companies, to do a plane design around the wings and the engines hanging below. And they won the contract for the B-47 bomber. And the B-47 bomber, of course, on a commercial side became the Boeing 707, and then the 727, and then the rest of the story. But something that allowed Boeing to begin to dominate the air.
Mm-hmm.
They had the most efficient, the most highly productive plane flying.
And what's interesting is shortly after these documents came available, I believe it was within a year, the information was made available to Douglas, to Boeing, and I don't know, who's the other big player at the time? Do you guys remember? There's three, right?
De Havilland was a player.
Yeah. So, I mean, this design of the wings, you know, going back, that was made available to all of them, but Boeing is the only one that made the change. So when they were actually submitting these documents for the bomber, Douglas still stuck with their guns, and they went with the aircraft that had three engines on it. One was on either side of the wing, but they were built into the wings, and then they had the third engine, which was on the tail. And despite this newfound technology, Boeing was the only one to jump on it. And I mean, there's a reason Douglas isn't around anymore.
Something, as Boeing became the major airline, there's something else that happened under the Carter administration.
Well, excuse me, they started to deregulating the FAA, and moving more toward that went on right through into the Reagan administration. And Robertson points out in his book, this is part of the decline of Boeing and companies, because they moved more towards, it became, especially with Reagan and guys like, Milton Friedman, developing that, saying that, companies' only responsibility is to their shareholders. That he points that as the reason that, you know, Boeing fell, and a lot of companies only focused on shareholder value as opposed to taking care of their customers, and being, in Boeing's case, being the safest plane out there.
But that actually came later. Deregulation certainly put a pressure on cost, and Boeing was expensive. I mean, Boeing in the late 90s had a fully burdened labor rate of $175 an hour, compared to Bombardier, for example, who was like in the 60s or 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Other companies had lower fully burdened labor rates.
Yeah, and then, but he also talks about this move to this guy took over this one company called General Electric, which was a behemoth and the largest company by market cap, I think, in the country. It had a $12 billion market cap. In 1982, this guy Jack Welch took over the company, and Jack started idea was that he was going to cut the company. He thought the company could do a lot better. So he was known as Neutron Jack because he closed plants. They had 117,000 employees, and he got rid of 1 out of every 4 employees was gone. And his motto was to get rid of the bottom 10% of management and employees, to get rid of them.
Wasn't that every year? Wasn't that every
Yeah,
year?
every year thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if that theory really works, but the other thing is that he kind of relates it to that the Welchification of Boeing. That's what was going on. I don't necessarily agree with him because if you look before that, and he doesn't mention this, companies were CEOs and management were compensated, Mike and Chris, by how big the company got. So you had companies out there, and if you read Jack Welch's book, he explains this. He said companies got CEOs were being compensated for how big the company became. So let's just go buy a bunch of assets and get the company big, and the CEO got compensated. And one of the metrics you look at, Mike, when we look at a company, what is return on assets? Are the assets productive? So you had CEOs making tons of money with buying buildings and whatnot that were not productive. And Jack Welch looked at that and said, this doesn't make any sense. Why do we want to be selling toasters at 10 cents a profit when we can sell jet engines and medical technologies, which is a growth industry, at 20 or 30 or whatever percentage was much more profitable business. And that's what he did.
But also, during that period of time was the time of the conglomerates. People did get paid more for building Teledyne, Ling Tempo Vote. The idea was if your company's stock was selling at 25 or 30 times price earnings, and you could buy a company that was selling for 10 times earnings, you could go out and buy them, and it was immediately accretive to your stock because the combined between the two, if you combined equally sized companies, for example, one that's got a PE of 20 and one that's got a PE of 10, when you combine the companies, if everything remained equal, you'd have a PE of 15. But the market's going to bid it up to 20. So you make money for the stockholders by buying another company. What that did, in the case of GE, they were able to buy and cut off things. But for a lot of those companies, the Ling Tempo Votes and the Boise Cascades, what it really meant is they didn't have managers that understood all the businesses they were buying. And one went bad, then another one went bad, then another one went bad. And those companies ended up caving in. And instead of their stock price being at 20 times the PE, they became times 2.
Well, it's kind of ironic, right? Because after Jack Welch left, the guy he picked as his predecessor, his successor, Jeff Immelt, kind of tanked the company. And the guy that took over from him that they've got, now what do they want to do with GE? They want to split it into 3 different companies. That's taking the Welch to the extreme, isn't it?
It is. And
but that's what makes sense, right? 3 separate businesses. You got the airlines, the airline engines and medical technologies, and then GE Capital. To be 3 separate businesses makes sense. It's so independent. How can each guy know what's going on?
So we're coming again to a commercial break. Don't go away, because we started to get to the point of what the change was from the early days of Boeing, when it was the Lazy Bee, when the whole focus was on safety and on building the plane which was engineered to be the safest plane in the air, to a focus on what the finances were. So I want to come back and paint the picture once again. I started to talk about it, that the fully burdened labor rate at Boeing was $175 an hour, when all the other companies had lower fully burdened labor rates. And when we talk about a fully burdened labor rate, it's not the wage that they're paying to the hourly workers that are down there putting the plane together. It's taking all the costs together and dividing it by the number of hours that the workers have on the floor. So if you have 200 people on the floor that are being paid $20 an hour, that's $4,000 an hour. But if you add overhead to that, when you add supervisors, when you add all the extra people, instead of $20 an hour, you're adding maybe an extra $100 per hour for all the overhead. That's what the fully burdened labor rate is. And that was a very high number. Worldwide, that was the highest number. And Boeing realized that. And part of the problem was the contracts they'd signed with the unions. I remember being involved on this side a little bit. And I remember talking to a company called Remily out of Minnesota. Remily had proposed manufacturing the doors because every door that went into the planes was built by a different company. So the door frame was built by a different company. The door was built by a different company. And when they assembled the fuselage and when they put everything together and the doors into the plane, they always had a problem getting the doors to fit exactly. And what Remily proposed was we will do the door frame and the doors, and the difference will be millimeters of an inch. Everything will fit. No matter what the door is, no matter what the door frame is, it will always fit. You'll save a lot of man hours because you don't have to rework and re-weld and shave parts of it off. You can save a ton of man hours. But the contract that Boeing had with the workers is you couldn't do things just to save man hours. You had to find jobs for those people that you reduced in other parts of the company. And so there was a big pushback trying to get the union to accept the Remily thing. And they'd been going, when I talked to them, I actually visited the Remily plant in Minnesota. It's amazing to see the machine work. And the lathes that are going, you just plug them into a computer and the computer does the whole thing. Remily had been working at this for over 3 years, trying to get the union to accept what they proposed. During those 3 years, had Remily been able to do that, Boeing would have been able to reduce the cost of doing those doors. I don't know if Remily ever got to do those doors. But Boeing realized they had problems. And my understanding is when Boeing moved to Chicago, there's a lot of different reasons given, but when you look at it, it looked like a layoff of overhead. They had 1,000 people in headquarters. They only invited 500 to go move to Chicago. The other 500, they said, we're sorry, we're moving. We're not going to employ you anymore. They moved the manufacturing plant to South Carolina and no union, getting around the problems with the people like Remily. So they didn't have a union contract. But that was just part of the approach. The other approach was a merger.
Well, it didn't. The merger happened before that. Those two things happened.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
Yeah. So chronologically here. So what happened was they merged with McDonnell Douglas. Was it 1996, I believe?
Mm-hmm.
And it ended up being that McDonnell Douglas actually took over Boeing. And the CEO from McDonnell Douglas said, "Oh, I'm going to retire anyways." And then he thought, no, the heck with it, I'm not going to retire. It was a guy by the name of Harry Stonecipher. And he brought in his cronies and his people, and they turned... So what Boeing was and McDonnell was. Right? At the time, Boeing was, like we talked about, it was a bunch of engineers who wanted to build a great product. McDonnell Douglas, when they went in and visited Boeing, they merged and bought Boeing or whichever. McDonnell Douglas's factories were like dilapidated. They had machinery that had been used since before World War II. Nothing was updated, no new technology. They got nothing for their money. But all they got was Harry Stonecipher. All he cared about was cutting costs.
Well, didn't they also get the exclusive right to the military contracts?
They did, but wasn't worth very much when they looked at all the machinery and what they had that they had to work with.
Well, then I remember saying that the Europeans got really upset that they were essentially going to have a monopoly over the military contract, and so they ended up giving that up. And so, essentially, the most profitable part of this deal, they just gave up.
And remember, McDonnell Douglas, under Stonecipher's leadership, they cut their R&D budget. They cut a lot of their budget. They made the stock soared under him for a while as the company got worse. You know, I use the example of a person that has a gas-fired car, gas-driven car, I don't know how to say it anymore because I have an
Combustion
electric car.
engine. Yeah.
Combustion engine.
You know, you can
Must have been
save
Stone Age over here.
you can save money if you don't change the oil for a short term
So you seize the engine.
till you seize up the engine, and that's what McDonnell Douglas had done. But anyway, I'm cutting out. Tell us more.
So that was the start of it, right? That was the start of the change that started to take place. And just to give you an example, it cost them $7 billion to produce the 777. And then when they wanted to produce the next level, the 787, instead of the engineers saying this is what we need to produce the plane, no, they said here's a budget. We'll give you $5.8 million, less than what it was to produce a 777.
And that's a much bigger plane too.
Yeah, it was much, and it's supposed to be more technologically advanced, if I can get the word out. And so it should have been a higher budget to produce the best, safest product out there, but it wasn't. It was designed by bean counters to what was the quote here? Gordon Bethune. Have you ever seen a bean counter build an airplane? And so when that becomes just the focus, especially when you're talking about, you're not talking about something you're not talking about an alarm clock or a radio or a stereo system, something like that. That okay, if it craps out, nobody's going to buy it again. Who cares? Company goes out of business. You're talking about if it fails, people lose their lives.
Yeah.
Big difference.
Hundreds of people lose their lives.
Yes, catastrophic.
And for the companies, it means the companies get sued. So it's a loss of life. It's a loss of revenue. Companies get sued.
And what did in the settlement with Boeing they had to put together was for the Jakarta flight or both flights, was it $500 million?
Yeah, I don't know.
Some ungodly amount of money, and then the fines. But then people are saying that's a drop in the bucket for them. I don't know if it's a drop in the bucket or not. That's what they had to do.
So when Stone Cipher came, what happened? We talked a little bit about the focus, but he brought his people with him too, right?
Mm-hmm. There was a cultural change, and we've been talking about it a little bit, but back in the day, for example, there was no expense spared, right? These engineers that would test parts, they would have these workstations, these IBM workstations that were over $100,000, right? That would never happen in this new age, right? And then there's another story I read in this book. It was like a small filter in the engine that would slowly decay over time because of microparticles, right? And one of the engineers suggested fixing it, but that fix would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It would take a lot of time. They'd have to do it to every single aircraft that had already been produced, the whole 9 yards, right? But Boeing didn't blink. They just implemented it because it was going to create a better product for their customers, right? They didn't care about the cost savings because they just wanted to create a good product.
That was the old Boeing.
But then the new Boeing, right? Well, the old Boeing was also, it was your classic Seattle hiker, right? It was your, it was the people that out on the weekends, they would go to your local lakes. They would probably be skiing. They were outdoorsy. They were nice. I don't want to say granola, but the quote here from the book is a very collegial, bloated, flaccid management structure, right? Where anything goes, you just come up, you show up and you put a good product together. And that's not the way it was with the McDouglas people.
Well, and then they started to get cozy with the stories in the book about how they got cozy with the FAA, right?
Correct.
Where they started, really trying to smoosh the FAA into only showing them what they wanted them to see. And then FAA attorneys and people there coming to work at Boeing and people going from Boeing to work for the FAA. And that became a revolving door and it became very cozy.
The FAA was a promotion for a lot of Boeing employees.
And, Boeing in the early days, as you had mentioned, when they had the crash and they said, look, this is what we did. Back in the early days, we made a mistake. This is a design flaw. We fixed it. So they developed a reputation with the FAA that they were honest and straightforward. Something that changed dramatically after they merged with McDonnell Douglas. Illustrated by the fact that they said, the reason the planes crashed is a pilot wanted to commit suicide. We laugh about it, but the truth is,
No, it's
hundreds
sad.
of people died because of that.
Yeah.
So what happened? If you look at the financials, if you look at the revenues, if you look at the PEs, if you look at all those things, they all look good. But you have to look beyond that when you're looking at companies. You have to look at what goes on with the culture. Not seeing the culture change resulted in a company which really experienced problems. We're coming to commercial break, and we're going to come back and talk about culture. We're going to bring it back to the 2 crashes, by the way. So don't go away. We've got more to go, and we want to bring it and summarize. What does all this mean?
About money with the AFC team, Mike, Chris, and Al on AM 1300, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So we've been talking about Boeing, basing a lot of what we know off the book that was written, Flying Blind, by Peter Robeson. Complete details in that book. But in using Boeing, it's one example. There's multiple examples where this happens. When you look at what's happening with companies, they have a certain culture, they have a certain focus, a certain dynamic. Started by talking about the Mariners. During the time when Howard Lincoln was managing the Mariners, the focus was not on getting to the World Series. The focus was on making money. And they did. They achieved that. As bad as the fans hated it, they achieved making money. That was the focus. At Boeing, the shift was in many ways the same way. They wanted to make more money. And it's not just looking at the revenues. It's not just looking at the earnings. It's not looking at what's going on. It's looking at the culture. 65% of the trades today are done by computers. Computers are really good at identifying things that are happening today. They can read the news faster than you or I. They absorb huge amounts of information. And they look at the revenues. They look at the profits. They look at the balance sheet. But there's not many computers that look at the culture. That's the advantage that we have. That's where we are. Richard Foster did a study and found that companies in the S&P in 1920 had an average life of 70 years. Today it's less than 15 years.
I think both of these companies, I think Boeing and Airbus are in serious trouble because there's a company in California called Boom Supersonic. They're making supersonic jets. They got orders from United and American Airlines for 20, 30 jets. There's supersonic jets will fly from Seattle to New York in 3.5 hours. And they say they'll be up and flying by 2030. And the CEO said his goal is to have everybody fly around the world within 4 hours for $100.
Oh, yeah.
And my question was looking at how are they going to, and I'm getting off the subject a little bit, but how are they going to lessen the sonic boom? But he said he already has 6,000 flight paths already, and their technology with the 4 engines they have and the way they've designed the plane, it lessens the sonic boom.
Yeah.
So this is coming. I mean, it'll be maybe it won't be 2030, but it's coming.
And there's a company that's in Moses Lake, I think, that's doing an all-electric plane. I mean,
Really?
Technology is really changing.
And you would expect Boeing to be on top of a lot of these, right? Buy them out. If they were really that great, if they were really, if these companies are good, wouldn't you expect Boeing to continue to dominate the market like they have for the last how many years? But
And they may do that.
I mean, but if Richard Foster, the study you just shared, I mean, it just looks more and more accurate. The Boeing stock price did really well during the later years, latter 90s and early 2000s, right?
You can look. I drive a Tesla. If General Motors and Ford had been smart, they would have bought Tesla 6 or 8 years ago. I mean, Tesla took the design. They took an electric car. Chevrolet had an electric car. Nissan had an electric car, but they were small. The range was 50 miles.
Yeah.
And they were expensive. So the only people that really bought the electric car, or most of the people that bought the electric car, were what we call the tree huggers, the people that were concerned about the environment. It came along somebody completely different to say, we can build a really nice car that will compete with Mercedes and Lexus and Infiniti, and we'll make it electric, and we'll source all the parts and the software inside the company.
And you don't see this on the balance sheet. You don't see what the company's focus is on a balance sheet, right? Boeing did its best when it was focused on making airplanes. Apple is not a recommendation buy sell, but Apple did its best when it was focused on making great computers and phones. And when Steve Jobs went, right, it's been a while since the phones changed. And you see this, if you focus on the product, the profits will come. And that's stuff that doesn't show up on the balance sheet. And that's one of the reasons you hire a professional to manage your portfolio.
Good point.
Yes, that's what we do. We do look at the culture. We do look at the companies in terms of who they are and what they are.
Yeah, there was a company a couple months ago, Mike, and you said you listened to their quarterly earnings, and you said that was the worst call you've ever heard. You said, terrible. It was the worst conference call I've ever heard. I never heard Mike get so mad at that. He was like, that was the worst I've ever heard.
And guess what? 2.5 weeks later,
and he said, you said, I think that CEO is going to be fired. It was 2 days later, that guy was gone.
2 days?
It was like 2 days. It wasn't even a week. And the reason why I make that point is because you picked up on something in that conference call that there was a culture change, a shift. That this guy was not the right guy for this job. And so that's something subtle and he was gone.
And he was the founder of the company.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
He built it into one of the most successful companies. But he just reached the point where he needed to be replaced.
Well, and I could say, there was a change in the focus. Initially it was about building a great software and developing a great product, and eventually became about, how much money can we make?
That's true.
And there's nothing wrong with making money, though. Let's not bash, right? Because we need companies. Companies are driven by revenues, by net earnings. Okay,
yes.
And so there's nothing wrong with what. And I go back to this in this book where I disagree with him. What Jack Welch did was right. Jack Welch said these companies are overbloated. They got too many assets that don't perform. Why am I keeping these? You can call him Neutron Jack and say whatever you want negative about him. Yeah, I'm sure he did some things wrong. He wasn't perfect. However, a lot of what he did was right. Moving companies to be more efficient. Companies need to be efficient.
As we come to this time, and we've talked about inflation before, we're going to deal with this probably for the next decade, maybe decade and a half. During this period of time, there's a big push on companies. If you look at the 60s and 70s when we had the high inflation before, there's a big push to cut cost, to increase productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a cultural change companies are going to have to go through. And a lot of those companies will try to do that by doing what Stonecipher did to Boeing. It's really going to be important to understand what the culture is and how they do that and how effective they are in terms of making it work.
Yeah, and if they turn around and take whatever excess revenues they have and try to boost, pay dividends and try to buy stock back, I think they need to still invest in R&D and making the company great.
Yeah. So that's our focus. That's where we are. That's what we do. We'll hope that this program you've gained some insight into what goes beyond the balance sheet, what goes beyond the income statement, what goes beyond the cash flow. It's the culture. And that's something that takes effort and time to understand. It's not obvious. It wasn't obvious in McDonnell Douglas that they were in trouble. It wasn't obvious in Boeing that they were in trouble. It wasn't obvious in Eastman Kodak that they were in trouble. It wasn't obvious in a lot of companies that they're really in trouble. But they are. And that's where we focus as we try to understand beyond the numbers what's going on within the company. Anyway, that wraps up this. Hopefully you gained a lot out of this. We don't recommend Boeing either buy or sell.
Or hold.
We just use it as an example. as we've used Eastman Kodak in the past, as we've used other companies in the past. It's something to learn from and avoid. Have a very good weekend. And the Mariners did make the playoffs. It was a change of culture. And by the way, they do not have a very high payroll compared to other teams.
Hopefully that changes this offseason.